Thank you so much for all of you that are here. I understand also that there are many more online, enjoying the fact that we have modern technology, which we will talk about, maybe why it's not so great, but enjoying that in order to not to suffer the Torontian weather. So it's with a pleasure that I introduce to you someone who have been following his work for quite a while, especially the book that he's going to talk about, Data and Democracy at Work, and Brishen Rogers, who is a professor in Georgetown, recently published that great book, which I highly recommend, and some of my students are forced to read. Also in the past, which I found even more interesting, actually work with unions and laborers. And if I remember correctly, you were even involved with janitors. No? Sorry, I should say the Justice for Janitors, for those of you who are not deep into labor politics. He was actually involved in organizing and making it happen. And you can ask him about that after the talk, but this talk would be about new technologies, the use of data, and labor. So without further ado, Brishen.
Thank you so much, Dan. And thank you, Stacy, for organizing, and thank you, everyone, for being here, both in person and online. It's interesting, I haven't talked about Justice for Janitors in quite a while, but it's directly relevant. I got interested in questions of sort of firm disaggregation and what, I later learned the term for value chains while working in the labor movement. Short version of the story is we were organizing workers and had to trace back the corporate ownership structure and worked our way through looking at a couple different shell companies and found out that the majority of the company ultimately was owned by a Dutch pension fund. And that opened up opportunities to speak to the pension fund about worker responsibility, but also got me interested in many of these issues that I'll talk about today about sort of how firms end up maintaining high quality when they are not actually producing goods in-house. That's a piece of the book, though only one piece. Okay, so I am really, really thrilled to be here. The core question in the book, sorry, one other preliminary. Thank you so much, Dan, for the pitch on the book. Don't buy it. Buy it if you want to, but it is available for a free download at MIT's website. It's available open sourced via MIT University Press through a new program that they have. So if you want to buy it, please buy it and I'll get royalties. But if you don't want to buy it, you can download individual chapters or the whole thing right there. Don't buy my book. Okay. So the core question here, how are new information technologies changing work? This is obviously a matter of significant public debate and significant public importance. I guess I'll give a third qualification. I'm coming from the US. My expertise is in US labor law and the US labor market. I will, draw some comparative points here, but I certainly have, a bit of a provincial US bias. A threshold point we have to ask here that I am trying to pull out and make more visible in the book is which workers are we talking about? So to this day, when you say the working class in the United States, the referent for that tends to be a industrial worker or a miner or perhaps a trucker, implicitly a white male industrial worker or miner. If you look at the data, that group is actually a relatively small part of the overall working class at this point. The working class is overwhelmingly in services, many of whom I have just represented on the slide. Food service, retail, home health aides, which is the largest and fastest growing occupational grouping in the US, warehouse workers, baristas, Uber drivers, and other gig economy workers. To the extent that we define a class in terms of common educational background, common market position, and common, subjection to similar sorts of discipline from their employers, I think it's safe to say this is a new working class. And it has, poses particular challenges for management, which I'll talk about, that are rather different from the challenges faced during the industrial era. Okay. How is technology changing work? Existing debate, I started the project some time ago and published a couple years ago. But when I started, existing debate was very focused on two things. Automation first, and then threats to worker dignity in the form of invasive surveillance or especially violation of anti-discrimination laws. Both of those are quite important, but what I argue in the book is that there's an additional set of behaviors and uses of tech that we need to attend to, namely to discipline workers, especially in the large service sectors that I just mentioned. And I'll spend most of my time talking about that today. I also argue that labor law reforms could encourage a different approach to workplace technology, and I'll preview that argument here. What I have on the slide here is actually quite indebted to Yochai Benkler's work, and I'll explain this. But Benkler has made the argument that most debates around technology and economic progress, economic growth, and the social cost of technology kind of assume away institutions for the most part. And so you have a linear story where progress in science and engineering ends up getting incorporated into innovations. Those increase productivity by enabling workers to make more output per unit of input. Law doesn't matter a whole lot, though. Institutions don't really matter. The state of technology is determined essentially by the state of science and engineering and by market forces. Class power relations do not matter very much here. Like power relations within the workplace don't really come in here. And part of what I try to do in the book is say, let's bring law and institutions into the picture and think about different uses of technology and whether there are ways to encourage other uses. So the U.S. here, it will not, I think, surprise anyone, and I'm not going to, I won't bore you with too much law today because I don't think there are that many legal scholars in the audience, but I will talk about it as necessary. The U.S. legal regimes governing work are characteristically employer-friendly in comparative perspective, and that manifests in a couple different ways. Employers have quite strong property rights within the enterprise and within whatever else happens in the enterprise. Unions tend to be weak, especially at the national level, but often to some extent within the firm level, and unions are rare as well. Employee privacy protections are a real patchwork. There is no omnibus employee privacy law in the US akin to the GDPR in Europe, for example. And we have narrow definitions of employment such that companies only owe duties toward workers who are sort of directly within their enterprise. I can talk more about what that means. But if we bring the legal regime and associated institutions together with the state of engineering, and we start thinking about the real uses of technology in the workplace, I think we get a picture more like what's on the slide here. Yes, a lot of technology, maybe the bulk of it, is used to enhance productivity. We're improving machinery, we're eliminating redundant processes, we are creating new processes that end up, we're reorganizing workplaces in ways that enhance production. But then there's a whole class of technologies that are used also to exert power over workers, surveilling them very, very closely and pushing them to work harder. Cutting their hours, right? Sort of squeezing them to the point that they work very, very intensely, but for shorter periods of time, so that their ultimate wages end up going down, and preventing unionization by spotting nascent unionization efforts and kind of trying to snuff them out before they get off the ground. And so the book is an exploration of how these different elements of the political economy of work really interact and how they did interact over the transition to a services economy and what, if anything, we can do about it. Okay, with that introduction, here's what I'm going to do. I'll talk a little more about services and the particular challenges posed by them. I'll say a bit about the legal context here, especially deunionization and the, you could say, contractualization or individualization of employment regulations, and employers and firms' ability to generate, capture, and utilize data from workplace processes. then I'll talk about how data is being used, and I break that into three categories: digital Taylorism, union avoidance, and fissuring and consolidation. And then I'll end with reforms in a slogan form: abolish, bargain, and socialize. I'll say exactly what I mean by that, but this is like a set of sort of like buckets of different reforms that could be used to have a different sort of set of uses of data, and I think ultimately a different political economy of technology. Okay, so the economic context is the service transition. You saw a version of this slide before, produced, I have to note, in part with artificially intelligent programs that are built into PowerPoint. I gave them the pictures and I typed in the text and it gave me a nice looking slide, which I couldn't have designed myself. So technology is at work right here. The large service sectors, again, are really sort of healthcare, food service, retail, logistics, and transportation. Just to graphically illustrate this a couple ways, this chart, if you can't read all of it, the orange line is the number of retail workers in the US, and the blue line is the number of manufacturing workers. Net manufacturing employment actually stayed basically stable from around 1958 until 1980, and then started to decline, and then declined rather precipitously in the 2000s. Retail employment, if you were to extend this chart back in time, grew pretty steadily, through the post-war, but then really took off a little before 1994. But this growth is a result largely of Walmart and some other retailers, coming into their own. It's also an effect of China's integration into the global trading system, right? A lot of manufacturing was starting to be done in China in the early 2000s and is now as well. And the very inexpensive consumer goods produced were then the backbone of Walmart and now Amazon as leading companies, consumer services companies, leading merchant capitalist companies, and also leading employers in these sectors. This is only retail workers, though, right? There are more retail workers than manufacturing workers by a good margin in the United States. You have similar numbers for food, for healthcare, and for logistics now. Also very significant numbers in hospitality and building services. Okay, it's easy to overstate these differences, but they are worth stating. How does this look in comparison to the post-war economy and political economy in the U.S.? This is a global transition, but it's especially pronounced in the U.S. And the reason the post-war economy is so important is, first off, we in the U.S. at least tend to look back on it as a kind of golden age of work and egalitarian capitalism. And also, a lot of our legal regimes governing work were designed for an industrial economy and don't really function as well in the economy we have now. What did that economy look like? Industrial workers and miners are kind of the canonical, I'll put both of these up, kind of the canonical workers at the time. Again, today, retail, food, and care workers. In the post-war, massive factories employing tens of thousands of workers together in one place. Today, Walmart employs 1 million people, but they're spread across thousands of smaller locations. The same is true of McDonald's, the same is true of Amazon. Productivity growth is tricky, and I don't want to belabor it because it's just so contested. But for quite some time, the model in the post-war economy was iterative productivity growth through improvements in machinery and in industrial production, which allowed for rising wages without significant profit pressures or without major profit pressures. That bargain, a lot of people would argue, broke down in the 1970s at one point. For now, the point is that it's just harder to eke out productivity growth in, say, a coffee shop and certainly in a hospital compared to a factory, at least, but factories doing primary manufacturing. Finally, there's deunionization, and I want to, I've worked in the labor movement. A lot of my heart remains with the labor movement. There's the fact that in the post-war, unions were often partners of management in various respects. They helped to train workers, they helped to recruit workers, they at times helped to discipline workers, right? They were a partner in governance, and those no longer exist. So what does this lead to? Well, the growth of modern data-driven technologies, the growth of the service sector, and the decline of unions all end up occurring at the same time, and I think they're linked processes. Part of what you see, it's by no means the only thing, but part of what you see is companies across the low-wage economy adopting surveillance technology as a mechanism of recruiting and managing and disciplining workers at scale. I'll give specific examples in just a moment. First, though, a little more data, or at least charts. So, as I said, union power declined and inequality surged over this period of the service transition, which you can think of as, 1980 through the present. This is a famous chart by the Economic Policy Institute, but essentially the red line tracks the share of income going to the top 10%, and the blue line is union membership. And these trends have largely continued. The growth of the top 10% actually, I think, has leveled off a little bit in the last 5 or 6 or maybe 10 years, but union decline has kind of continued. Second point is that the collapse of unionization and the growth of inequality has been especially pronounced in the United States. This is a chart from Kathy Thalen's work from her lecture she gave in 2019, comparing unionization rates and collective bargaining coverage across countries. Interestingly, so the US is way down at the left side, it's in red. Canada is closer to the top, actually, despite having a fairly similar labor law model to the United States. All the way at the right-hand side, Denmark, Finland, Sweden, the Nordics, as they often are in comparisons such as this. What to take from this? Many, many things. A major one, though, is just the extent of the collapse of unionization in the U.S. at the same time that the U.S. is really leading the world in technological innovation, the growth of the new service economies and new forms of merchant capitalism, and now the gig economy. And I think those trends are closely related. Okay, let me say just a little bit about law. I can come back to this in Q&A. The basic structure of our labor laws in the U.S. has not been changed since the 1930s or 1948, depending on who you ask. And I can say more about exactly how, but a particular shift that I think is illustrative is just in how the Supreme Court has understood employment as a relationship. It was once understood as a collective relationship in which workers were jointly helping to set terms and conditions of employment through unions. And the court said this quite explicitly. One of the canonical post-war labor law cases, Steelworkers, a collective bargaining agreement is an effort to erect a system of industrial self-government. This meant that the baseline assumption was workers had rights to participate in setting the rules that governed their work lives, not just wages and hours, but also questions of employee discipline, issues of surveillance, things of that nature. Here's a much more recent statement that points in, I think, a very, very different direction. This is from a case, Epic Systems Corp v. Lewis, considering whether our National Labor Relations Act, it's sort of complicated, but essentially whether workers' decisions, whether agreements to arbitrate should be legally binding, even when they waive the right to proceed as a class, even when they waive rights of class action. The outcome here is not surprising. What is kind of striking is the way that Justice Gorsuch frames the question. Should employees and employers be allowed to agree any disputes between them will be resolved by one-on-one arbitration? 2 points here. First, putting employees first. I mean, I don't want to, go too deep into a sort of textual exegesis of this quote, but I think it's right on its face. As if employees requested this provision in their employment contracts, which they did not. The way the provision got into the employment contract is the employer came in one day, said, we have a new arbitration policy. If you return to work tomorrow, you will be considered to have agreed to this. And therefore, it is then binding as a part of your employment contract. Employees did not want this. They fought against it. But Gorsuch frames it as a matter of employees' individual choice. Second, through one-on-one arbitration, which is often extremely ineffective in the employment context, because if you're litigating around unpaid wages or patterns and practices of discrimination where workers are, where there's longstanding patterns of occupational segregation, individual litigation doesn't work. Either you can't get an attorney or you have to have a class of people before the court or before the arbitrator in order to get actual relief. Epic Systems took that option off the table for many, many workers in the United States. Stepping back, rather than understanding employment as a distinctive social relation that has to be jointly governed by workers and management, it's understood much, much more as any ordinary contract. Anything one agrees to is prima facie acceptable and binding. That's the first point on law. Here's a second point on law. So sort of think about this structurally and operationally. How has Uber changed the system of finding and getting a taxi ride in pretty much every major city in the world? Part of what they have done, I think we're all broadly familiar, part of what they have done is captured workers' skills through a process of surveillance and data extraction, and then actually leased those back to drivers. And let me sort of back up. Maybe don't pay attention to what's on the slide for a moment. Taxi drivers used to have a particular form of craft knowledge. They would know where to pick up rides at particular times. They would know how to get through a crowded city during rush hour. The system was far, far, far from perfect. But the fact that they had that specialized knowledge gave them some bargaining power in the market. In London, as you probably know, you have to take a test called the Knowledge, where you essentially memorize large chunks of the map of London so that you can tell an examiner exactly how you get from point A to point B without ever looking at a map. It's just, it has to be memorized. Okay, what does Uber do? Well, get workers onto the app, which we'll talk about. Then they monitor their driving, gather data, figure out what does it look like to get from point A to point B during particular times. Analyze that data to optimize matching between passengers and drivers, to optimize routes, to optimize timing. Incorporate that knowledge into its app such that almost anyone can jump in and do the job, whereas previously taxi drivers, required extensive training. And then, because Uber controls that information, leases that knowledge back to drivers, right? So a driver on the platform essentially is paying Uber a commission to access a store of knowledge that was once embodied among a set of taxi drivers. What are the legal foundations of this? Well, one is deunionization, which preceded Uber's emergence in the US by about 20, 30 years, but it meant that workers had no voice in technology. A second is meager privacy rights, which allowed Uber and many other gig economy companies to gather all this data without workers' say-so. The fact that we treat employment as a contract and extend broad property rights to employers means the company effectively owns the data, even once it is gathered from workers who have consented only by virtue of doing their jobs. So essentially, the employer is aggregating that data and constructing models with it and exercising ownership rights. And over the course of that, enclosing the knowledge, and again, as I said before, leasing it back to drivers. This is the most, I think, extreme and somewhat straightforward example of this, but I think you see similar processes elsewhere in the economy. And I'll mention a couple. Okay, so how are employers how have they used this power to disempower workers? I want to talk about automation and digital taylorism. Digital taylorism is essentially breaking jobs into tasks that can be done, that can be mechanized to some extent, and then supervising workers much more closely. It's a digital form of Frederick Taylor's original form of Taylorism. Union avoidance, using tactics that are illegal in many, many countries and borderline in the US and sometimes illegal in the US. And then fissuring or splitting off operations from the corporate center, but still maintaining tight control and surveillance over those operations. I do want to talk I'll talk a little longer about digital Taylorism because I want to talk about automation and what is and is not, I think, happening here. So you have no doubt seen a million news stories and other reports about the extent of the automation threat. This is from Andrew Yang in 2019. Today, it takes the form of discussion of ChatGPT, which has its own sort of promise and limits. I'm just going to assume familiarity here and say I am not that worried. I think the robots are not coming, or they're coming only in quite limited numbers. So there are a few reasons for this that I break into three categories. This slide is kind of old and hokey, but it still works, I think, because it's demonstrating the thing that we all have seen from ChatGPT. So the way that modern AI is trained, as I think we all know now, is that the large language models or image spotting algorithms are trained on a large set of data. They draw inferences from that data, and then they develop models and apply that data to things in the real world. One problem here is that the models do not have any social context for what they're doing. And an old and famous, and I think still helpful example of this is that if you train a model to spot chihuahuas, the little dogs, it will erroneously also spot blueberry muffins with some regularity. Because the kind of pattern of pixels in the picture of a blueberry muffin, if you look at this quickly, like you would actually kind of probably make the same mistake, right? But then after a minute, you can kind of analyze and be like, no, that's a muffin, that's a dog, that's a muffin, that's a dog. This is a version, of the hallucination problem that we have all heard about or experienced with ChatGPT. More on that in just a moment. You may be familiar with this event where an Optimus robot at Tesla was, I don't even know what they were doing, but essentially did this motion like this and then toppled over. Tesla claims these robots are acting autonomously, and lots of people online pointed out that is precisely what somebody would do if they were taking off a headset being used to control the robot. And of course, as soon as they took the headset off using that motion, the robot fell backwards. Final one, I'm going to wait till I move forward. My co-author we've only co-written one or two things together, Kate Andreas, was using generative AI, she told me this just last night, for research to kind of develop a, sort of background understanding on something, see who'd written about certain things, and got this forthcoming article. Kate Andreas and Brishen Rogers, Rebuilding Worker Power, 113 California Law Review. It doesn't exist. I mean, we have not written it. We have no plans to write it. We've never said we're going to write it. It's a title that we would use if we were going to write something. So you can kind of see how the hallucination has a tiny bit of bearing in reality. And I said to her, what we really ought to do is set up a Google alert and see if someone cites this in the future, saying it was in fact published in the California Law Review. Okay, the hallucination problem, which many of the pioneers of large language models effectively think is insolvable. I actually think they're incredibly powerful. I think their impact on the workers I'm talking about is mediated through multiple layers of management, and so probably less important than its impact on, say, lawyers and medical professionals and engineers and the like. We can come back to that. Okay. Technical limitations is reason one. Reason two, the occupational structure. I already talked about this, and I just love this slide because this was from a venture capital firm 10 or so years ago saying these are the jobs we want to automate. What is so ironic about that is that these are some of the most difficult jobs in the world to automate. Plumbers, landscapers, hairdressers, and dry cleaners. All of these jobs require very fine motor skills and situational judgments, such that it's extremely hard to develop, robotics that would come close to doing them, which are really useful in scenarios where you can control everything in the input layer and have a robot doing the same thing again and again and again. That's just not how haircutting works. It's not how plumbing works. It's certainly not how landscaping works. Third reason is what I'd call the anthropomorphic fallacy. Someone else may have used this term, and if so, I'm probably stealing it. We often assume that automation is going to actually kind of take the form of replicating what a person does when they are performing tasks. What's much more common is that machines will be developed to do the task in a completely different way. So if you're going to develop a machine to wash dishes, do you want a robot to wash the dishes, or do you want a dishwasher, right? These are very different ways of doing, like, getting the same type of thing done. But I think, in part because of Hollywood, in part because, companies like Tesla keep advertising it, we're very focused on anthropomorphic robots, and that's just not how things have worked. It might change, right? We might get there at some point. But what we see much, much, much more often is, again, iterative automation, task by task, and sometimes reshaping entire processes. I'll have another example of this in just a moment. So here's what I can say, with, I think, some confidence. We are seeing automation. We always see automation. We are not going to see automation at a level that causes mass technological unemployment. We might get mass unemployment for other reasons, but I do not think labor displacement is the reason. As I think I said before, I finished the book before ChatGPT came online, and it does scramble some of the analysis here. My own view is that almost anything verbal and visual, will be altered by those programs. I can talk about its utility for legal analysis, which is significant, though, legal expertise, I think, is not going away. But the major impact on working class jobs, I think, is going to be mediated through management. Okay, so what do I mean by these three buckets? The first, as I said before, digital Taylorism. This is sort of the dishwasher story, but at scale at Amazon. Amazon has for a long time wanted to fully automate warehouses. They're getting closer and closer. They originally wanted to develop robots that would move between shelves and grab goods off shelves. It turned out that what could be automated was not that, but rather the bringing of shelves to people. And they purchased a company that does exactly that. They're now on the second or third or fourth generation of those robots. Before the pandemic, I was able to tour an Amazon warehouse. If you're able to do it still, I would highly recommend going if you have the opportunity. They're just technological marvels. It is incredible the way that the company weaves together these robotics, other robotics, automated assembly lines, and human workers. What is not happening is, not yet, for some time anyway, so-called dark warehouses where people are replaced entirely because hands are very, very, very difficult to engineer, and you need people to make the situational judgments between different types of packages. So what did Amazon do? We have workers now, I think people probably know this now, that robots bring the shelves to workers. Workers grab goods off shelves and put them into bins that are then taken away for packing. The workers themselves are in these workspaces not a whole lot bigger than this podium, maybe a foot or two on either side, and subject to nonstop surveillance from multiple cameras pointed at them at all times to determine if and when they're selecting what the programs think are the wrong packages, and also how long it's taking them to do particular tasks. The workers at Amazon have said, and for years, and continue to say, the pace of work is very difficult and constantly being ramped up, and that repetitive stress disorders and other injuries are extremely common from having to stand in one place and just do these repetitive tasks again and again. So what do we have? Again, automation of some tasks but not all, and then jobs that end up becoming mind-numbingly boring. Workers are also in Amazon warehouses separated from one another. And this may or may not be intentional. I tend to think it may be. But it makes it much harder for them to even develop relationships with other workers. Shifts can be staggered in certain warehouses or not regularized so that you don't see the same workers coming in every day. That makes it harder to build the relationships of solidarity that are necessary for unionization. So the physical space of the plant is quite important here as well. I'm going to skip this over. I won't. So what has Uber automated? Not driving. We might get automated driving at some point. But location services, matching between drivers and passengers, that used to require a dispatch or a hail, right? That's essentially an automated process now. GPS directions and payment processing. Vina Dubal's work on this is just foundational, but many of those surveillance technologies are also used, again, to discipline workers, push them to work longer hours, and to often do so without more pay. Okay, that's bucket one. Bucket two, union avoidance through surveillance and data analysis. How do unions form? Workers have to get to know one another. They need to talk to one another. They need to build trust with one another. It's an intense process, almost always requiring in-person contact. To the extent workers are talking about unionization drives in their own workplace, that is lawful as long as it's done in non-work time. But if an employer has devices that can pick up on their conversations, the employer may be able to spot that a unionization drive is afoot. I haven't seen direct evidence of that. I have seen direct evidence of the following. Amazon hired an intelligence analyst to try to use sort of data on workers' movements and to the extent they could pick up on workers' off-duty conversations to spot union organizing threats. Facebook pitched to some investors a tool that could be used. They actually said a tool to suppress unionization internally. If employees on your sort of internal chat boards or Slack or whatever start using terms like unionize or collective action, Facebook said you could get an immediate notification so that you can find out and stop the drive. Google, similarly, when some of its workers started organizing, changed the internal policy so it was impossible for workers to book meetings where more than something like 3 people would be present without permission of their manager. So the day-to-day surveillance in the workplace, in addition to kind of structuring workplaces as Amazon does, day-to-day surveillance can also enable companies to spot nascent organizing drives and push back. Okay, final bucket is data-driven fissuring, so surveilling workers while denying them basic employment rights. Uber's model is a great one here, right? Again, treat drivers as individual contractors, watch them very closely while they're driving, sometimes using cameras, literally, but argue we have no duties toward them under wage and hour laws, collective bargaining laws, anti-discrimination laws. Why? Essentially, the fact that they are not subject to human surveillance, the fact that they can set their own hours, at least in theory, the fact that Uber does not brand their vehicles in particular ways, allows Uber to disclaim that set of responsibilities, but at the same time, they're getting most of the benefits of a standard employment relationship by being able to surveil and discipline. Similarly, McDonald's the national McDonald's is able to see order processing times at the store level and even see how long it's taking for individual workers to do individual pieces of that production process. The NLRB under Biden, in the early Biden years, pushed for a finding of joint employment so that McDonald's would be held responsible for labor law violations by its franchisees. The franchisees are nominally separate companies, and got pretty far. Sorry, this is under Obama. Got pretty far, and then when Trump was elected, the suit was withdrawn. But the principle is the law, as it has evolved, largely permits large companies to do that surveillance without thereby getting or bearing employment law duties. Okay, skipping over this. What can we do? And here I'll say a bit more and then wrap up. So this is the slide I had before on institutions and workplace technology. All of the particular uses I just spoke about would go in the power enhancing box, right? They might also enhance productivity, but part of why they are being used is often to prevent workers from taking collective action, to make workers work faster without actually augmenting their productive capacity through technology. And the basic theory here is, well, one, there are many other many other policies go into employers' technological choices, but workplace relationships are one of them, and the laws governing work are one of them. And if workers are empowered to resist some forms of technology, that might create more of a virtuous cycle where we get productivity enhancement, where productivity enhancement is favored. You can picture this in the following way. If employees have power at the worksite and economy-wide levels, if they have robust privacy rights, if we have broader definitions of employment, employers will, because the power augmenting side of this is foreclosed, they will have more incentive to invest in productivity enhancement. I should say here, there is evidence for this, pointing in this direction from the varieties of capitalism and other comparative political economy literatures. Insofar as some of the options of sweating are foreclosed, for example, in Germany, you see very different workplace level and firm level practices in, say, call centers in Germany. There's a scholar at Cornell whose name is escaping, Virginia Dolgast, wrote a great essay and a book on this. The same company working in the US and Germany may have very, very different uses of workplace technology and have a more cooperative relationship with workers at the same time. The other thing that you see, and I found this in doing research for the book, hard to quantify, but it did come up a number of times. If you have a sector in the US where you have a union, sort of part of it is union and part of it is non-union, the non-union side is likely to get the leading edge of surveillance technology earlier because unions can effectively block it. So insofar as you can foreclose that set of options, the option to use just greater and greater surveillance, you can encourage enhancements in productivity. What would those mean? Just look at the left side here. Nothing wrong with factory and workplace robotics. Workers actually want them, especially insofar as they're eliminating, very, very terrible jobs. Automated inventory at a lot of retail outlets, right? That used to be a very important and mind-numbingly boring task that managers had to do, to take inventory all the time. Use of machine learning to match passengers and drivers at Uber. Why not, right? I mean, insofar as it actually enables people to get what they need more quickly, that should have a productivity enhancing effect. And I can say more about this, but effectively, foreclose the power exerting side and maybe you get more productivity enhancement. Okay, so the slogan. Abolish, bargain, and socialize. By socialize, I just mean put to social purposes. I don't mean sort of, own collectively necessarily. What would abolition entail? Ban the use of certain technologies in the workplace, especially facial recognition and emotion recognition. Ban surveillance of workers outside the workplace. It's interesting, I've come to think that is less common than a lot of us had been afraid of. And I can say more about this in the Q&A. But there are sort of reasons, it sounds like, that employers don't want to surveil workers off the job, rooted in privacy, healthcare related duties, and ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, for example. And then limit rights to surveil even while at work. This has been a big push of warehouse unions and warehouse advocacy organizations. So in California, legislation has been passed. I don't recall if it's in effect yet. Basically saying, Amazon, if you're going to use data from surveillance to discipline a worker, number one, they have to have basics of due process, such as a right to appeal that decision. But even before that, they have to know what the standards are. This is pretty basic stuff, but it is being legislated now in California, and the Amazon labor union has been demanding it. Another example of that, and so all of these are things also that workers and advocates have been demanding. West Virginia teacher strike, which was a historic strike in the US, one of the issues there was an employer demand that teachers wear biometric devices, which would have lowered their healthcare costs. Employers actually continue to do this in the US. With employer-provided healthcare, obviously the employer's premiums and cost are going to go down if the workforce is healthier. And so a Fitbit-type device is a kind of nice way to nudge workers to exercise more often, watch their calorie take, get their steps in, et cetera. West Virginia teachers were very upset about this, and they actually won this as a demand. The state withdrew that demand. As I said, warehouse workers demanding an end to algorithmic discipline is another major development. Okay, the second is data bargaining. And here the idea is that you give workers the capacity to bargain over how data is gathered and used and how technological developments are rolled out in the workplace. Along roughly the models, if you know, of how German works councils have consultative rights, but perhaps bargaining rights to some extent here. What would this entail or require legally? Easier rights to unionize, stronger rights to strike, paths, I think, to sectoral bargaining, so all workers can bargain at the sector level. But then make data practices and other technological choices, in the US parlance, mandatory subjects for unions. Unions can bargain over tech that might be used for discipline, have much more limited rights around productivity enhancing technology. Just make it all bargainable and allow worker pressure to actually change employers' incentives. Another option would be to guarantee these rights regardless of unionization status. So if the employer wants to implement a new set, I keep coming back to this, but the point, it sort of illustrates the point nicely, a new set of surveillance cameras, give workers some rights to consult over what those are and how they're going to be used before they are in fact implemented. This also has come up in worker activity recently. So Marriott hotel workers, this is a strike a while ago now, but it sort of started the trend. They demanded and won a voice in the deployment of new technology, for example, how Marriott's app was going to check people into rooms. And also over technology that was then being rolled out on the order in which they were required to clean different rooms. Both of these were the ordering app was quite annoying and controversial because it led to workers having to walk much longer distances within the hotel, and they actually won the right to have a voice in that. Actor strikes in the U.S. last year or the year before. I have no sense of time anymore. One of the demands there, and again they won, was around use of AI likenesses and use of their images to train different AI-powered devices. Final would be data socialization, which essentially means use data-driven technology to facilitate worker organizing. I'll go through each of these examples. One would be, require raw data on when workers are actually in the work site and what their hours were to be sent to regulators. The hours have to be reported to some extent, but the hours that workers are actually, the hours of work have to be reported, but the time on site does not. If workers are on site for quite a bit longer than they're being paid, that is a red flag, not a particularly difficult one to spot, but one that's hard to spot externally now, that they're not being paid all the hours of work. Just heard about this from a medical clerk yesterday in DC. A second would be, if you as a company are surveilling workers within your value chain, within your operations, that gives rise to employment duties. So Uber, you can make a choice between having duties toward the set of drivers and intensely surveilling them all the time. Then the third would be what I think of as digital picket lines. Amazon workers go on strike at a particular warehouse. In the past, prior strikes, prior era, they would be on the street, picketing and leafleting. At a warehouse, it's not going to do you any good. Why not? A consumer who orders from a good that's going to come from that warehouse could get a notification. This warehouse is on strike from the Amazon app, right? Are you sure you want to order from this location at this time? And by doing that, enable consumers to sort of act in solidarity with workers. So these are all mechanisms of using new technological means to kind of help workers build, or help enforce laws and also help workers build more solidarity. I said this before, but one example of this in the past was the demand by the Obama NLRB that McDonald's be held responsible for unfair labor practices among its franchisees on the grounds that their surveillance of those workers should give rise to an employment duty. This did not succeed, but it certainly feels plausible as a legal and operational matter to me. So again, this is the goal, right? Can we encourage more productivity-enhancing technology, cut off the path toward just ever-increasing power-augmenting technology? There are many pieces of this, but I do think labor law is one of them. Okay, thank you so much. I will leave it at that, and I guess Dan's going to come up for the Q&A. Here we go.
Just to remind people, because we have so many people also online, if you want to ask a question, there's notes there. If you can just give them around. You're going to tell me questions online? Like, how do I get those? Okay, perfect. So as we do that and try to get into a hybrid kind of event with its own issues, which you just presented, I want to ask you something which I think I like. I don't think. I liked in your book, but I'm not sure you talked about enough, apart from just mention it right now.
You say you don't like in my book?
I like in your book.
You like in the book.
But I don't think people think about it enough when you think about unions. Part of a problem of a digital economy and the fact that so much of it happened in digital space is indeed that if labor want to forget the organizing that you talked about, forget about the ability to actually meet, which I think you should mention more, and I'll be happy to hear more. But even to let the world that they're doing something.
To let the world know.
Yes. Yeah, is extremely difficult. As you said, right now, Amazon or your favorite food delivery app might have a lot of industrial action, and you will never know about it.
Right.
And it's not clear how the unions over labors actually would be able to do that. When you have a lot of different warehouse as a management, you just move it from place to place. When you used to have a factory, if a factory closed down, too bad for your company. You actually have to come to a table. And also people are aware of that. Have you seen, anything that is done to circumvent that? Have you seen any movement on the law? Have you any ideas apart from what you just mentioned, is that I get something in the app?
Yeah, so I'm probably going to do this a few times. In some ways, I think the problem's even more dire. So the big upsurges in union activity in the U.S. historically, and many other countries too, occurred during the recent ones, during the period of industrialization and industry and sort of the building out of the factory system in the 1930s and 1940s. Then there's a big upsurge in the 1950s and especially the 60s among healthcare workers and some public sector workers. Industrial workers were not only in factories together, they were very often living in the same neighborhoods. And that was a pretty important part of their organizing strategies at the time. You read accounts of strikes from that period, especially in places like Pittsburgh, Toledo, Chicago, and the cities could be shut down very quickly because other workers would learn of the strike and walk out in sympathy. This is before that was banned. But it's very hard to imagine that happening in a much more suburbanized jurisdiction, and that's where workers are now. Starbucks workers are very unlikely to all live in the same neighborhood. They're going to be spread out over a particular jurisdiction. Now, they have the advantage, at least, of coming together in the workplace and building solidarity there. It's a constant challenge for Uber drivers and other gig economy workers like that who aren't even co-located at any time. So they never have the capacity to come together. Okay. What does that mean in terms of gaining consumer support? The best examples that I have seen are Amazon and Starbucks. And in both cases, the way that workers got consumer support was in part by talking to, in the Starbucks case, talking to customers and, individuals in their particular neighborhoods, but also just extremely skillful use of social media. Amazon was brilliant at this. Starbucks was brilliant at this in the early days. There's a story that I think tells you so much about how the Starbucks campaign got off the ground. Starbucks used to ask all baristas when they posted something on Instagram or Twitter to put the hashtag to be a partner or partner life, something like that, which is basically like, here I am doing my Starbucks thing, what it's like to be a partner. It was always to celebrate the company. When the campaign launched, when the union launched, they had all their social media sites ready. And what did? They tagged every single post with partner life or to be a partner or whatever it was. And so every Starbucks barista around the country who was on social media learned about the campaign immediately. So there are brilliant things you can do in that respect, and that's just sort of communicating with other workers. Further communications online using social media were extremely effective. I do think that the options of if you're organized in an Amazon warehouse, it just is difficult to picket or leaflet in a way that's going to generate that much consumer attention, and so you have to go to media. In some respect, I don't know that it's a solvable problem, unfortunately. I can talk. I'll just put a pin. The recent general strike in Minneapolis might be, illustrative here, but let me just put that to the side for the moment.
Okay, so there's actually let's continue with that because there is at least one questions, maybe two, that really talks about that, and that is. The ability so we talked also on our friend Yochai Benkler from Harvard, which you just mentioned. And if you read his first book, The Power of Networks, he explained how the internet and all those wonderful technologies will create a wonderful democracy, and we will all sing and dance and read and kumbaya. And he's a good friend. And now I basically asked him what is his book, and he said, my book is explaining how capitalism defeated me in every possible way every time I thought the digital new technologies will lead to democracy. But you just mentioned with the hashtags and other instances in which those technology also help workers organized. We had few flickers of hope in the Arab Spring, if anyone remembers that, where those new technologies actually help people to organize and strike. And then we have a counter. Where do we stand on that? And do you have more example? Because somebody actually would love to hear about them. The second, which I think is more important from your presentation, does the law have any role to play and any say on making this happen and making this, I don't know if whether to use the word right, but at least possible?
Sure. So let me give a sort of potted history of some of this. There's a very, very good book by Zeynep Tufekci, whose name I'm not pronouncing right, who teaches at UNC Chapel Hill, called Twitter and Tear Gas, I believe. And her argument is the Arab Spring and the color revolutions and some of the early kind of large-scale mobilizations around things like Occupy Wall Street used social media to get people into the streets very effectively. They demonstrated, sort of showed that there was latent discontent in various spheres around many things. But in some sense were a victim of their own success is the wrong term, but it was so easy in some sense to put together large demonstrations that just became part of the repertoire of action for groups that were, protesting governments. This hasn't really happened in the labor space until Starbucks. The challenge is that effectively the ease with which you could organize through social media meant that a lot of organizations did not do the hard work of actually building institutions, building leadership structures, figuring out, processes for developing demands and articulating demands. But you've seen a lot of shift in that in the last couple of years especially. I think of Starbucks, like the social media aspect of it, and the same is true of Amazon, and then I'll come to Minneapolis, as a next iteration of social media type organizing. Black Lives Matter is kind of an intermediate step here, where you have a combination of very intense on-the-ground interpersonal organizing that really is very often face-to-face, almost always face-to-face, with social media as a mechanism of amplifying and getting the message out. That is, I think, the best I can say about social media in those contexts, right? It helps to build public support, and to some extent it helps to build support among workers. It does not challenge the power structure, and it can facilitate some challenges, but it does not do much to, say, employers' ability to discipline union activists, terminate them, and the like. It helps to build public support, but that's about it. I don't think that, I do think this is still very important, though, because it's a decentralized form of local organizing, Starbucks is, and other union drives recently, that are facilitated by that to an extent, and that can be the basis for, we're going to see how it plays out over the long term. I want to be cognizant of time. The story in Minneapolis, let me say two things about it maybe. You have a combination of, I don't know how widely reported this is, so
you don't assume it's widely.
Okay. Combination of neighbors literally doing just old style mutual aid, but often through signal chats. So they'll set up a signal chat for their neighborhood, or a couple different ones for the area, and say, if you see ICE, let us know on the signal chat, and people will simply have that open, or a call, like a phone call, a signal phone call, open throughout the day so that they can communicate in real time about what's happening. And that's remarkable, right? The technology to do that did not exist, 5 years ago, maybe 7 years ago. The other thing is, I guess I'm making sort of still on the first point, it's really mutual aid in the classic sense of people bringing meals to others, like helping people get rides, keeping an eye out for other people in their neighborhoods, in a way that I think really does build networks of solidarity that will end up having a longer life as a result. The other piece, though, that I want to mention, and gets to the law point, there was a general strike, as I'm sure you saw, or at least a large-scale, sort of stoppage of economic activities. Some people don't want to call it a general strike. 3 weeks ago, 2.5 weeks ago now. It was not organized in the first instance by the unions, as far as I've been able to tell. There's a great podcast in the U.S., The Dig, and they had on some of the union organizers and the faith-based organizers in the Twin Cities. The faith-based organizers had been talking about doing this for some time. They put it together. And one of the major unions that was involved was on the podcast, the president of that union. He said, we signed on when we went to a meeting and 95% of our members told us they were not coming to work that day because they had been already in contact with faith-based organizations who had, sort of pulled them, encouraged them to strike. Well, that is actually quite legally risky for a union to do in the United States because it's a secondary boycott. They can, face, civil contempt charges, an injunction, and damages, significant damages potentially. So it's no accident that unions did not take the lead. It is striking, though, that it came about nonetheless, and it'll be interesting to see what, if any, legal consequences there are.
Okay, that's great. I'll just, not to ruin the atmosphere, I will say that you have again demonstrated how close geographical proximity neighborhoods
Yes.
and actually meeting not on digital is important.
It's essential.
Not clear to me how surveillance technology or digital technology makes this better, and whether what you actually described in Minneapolis wouldn't have been even more widespread without digital technology and without the government using surveillance. I just don't know. So that's where I hear you, but I'm wondering whether what you actually are saying is this is happening despite surveillance.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, yeah. I think that the positive uses are really only, I mean, again, Signal is not surveillance technology, right? It sells itself specifically as a distributed network that does not engage in surveillance. A lot of it is incurred in opposition to surveillance technology. The only sort of positive story that intersects with the kind of the machine learning mechanisms and things of that nature is really the social media advertising of union efforts. I think that's the only positive story that I have seen. Okay. I will say there's one other, but it doesn't require machine learning. In the Starbucks campaign, you have a lot of instances of workers training other workers in how to unionize, doing it over Zoom. You don't need advanced machine learning to do that. You do need a sort of video platform to do it. And so the existence of the video platform has been very helpful, and it creates a kind of parasocial relationship. But then the organizing still happens completely face-to-face. I don't think there's a substitute for it.
So before I move to a few questions about actually automation and the taking away of knowledge and government, one last question, which I think is slightly more pessimistic about digital technology and civil action. And that is a question about whether the fact that you sort of do things on the internet and it's easy and you feel as if you've done something, but in the real world nothing happened. Mm-hmm. You sign a petition on Google.
Yes.
Actually lower real activism. And I'll give you an example from just small democracy or labor experiment that just happened. Here in Toronto, my daughter goes to a public school. The TDSP has a contract to give lunches. That contractor decided that they don't really like laborers, so they now have only one person to serve a whole high school through lunch, which doesn't work, in case you're wondering. It just doesn't work. And not only that, they basically fired or removed one out of the two on the last day before the exam, so the students couldn't say bye or even see them for 3 weeks. And some students tried to organize them. It became very clear that in order for anything to happen, they actually need to do something in the physical world, mm-hmm. and not just send emails. As soon as that was asked from the students, the highly activist, progressive students who have blogs, but they were absolutely unwilling to go to a picket line because it was away from the keyboard. So I'm wondering whether you have any data about that.
I don't. Are not ready to hand anyway. There have been studies of this. I'm trying to think if Alex Hertel-Fernandez looked into it at one point. I think he did not, actually. He looked into something else related. What I would say is I think it's case specific, right? There are certainly cases where initial online engagement may lead people to take other engagement. Think of Black Lives Matter in that respect in the US. A lot of people were posting and signing petitions and the like, and a lot of people got in the streets. And there may be sort of a pathway through which initial actions online can lead to offline actions of that sort. But, in other cases, it would certainly end up sort of making people feel like they've done enough. I mean, I do think this is another lesson of Minneapolis and to some extent of the Starbucks organizing that I studied. I did a whole project, I don't know if I said this, where I was with RAs interviewing Starbucks workers who organized to try to better understand what led them to do it, how they used the law, and learned the law and used the law through that process. It's should be published very soon. It's an old kind of calling. It's an old explanation, right? But people tend to take action when they need to improve their material conditions. And I define material pretty broadly, right? And a really, really important material condition is like threats to your life, right? Threats to your well-being. People take action when they feel under threat. So I'm not shocked that high school students are not taking action, in solidarity with the workers in the cafeteria. A lot of high school students at high schools have been walking out in the U.S. because they're worried about ICE. And, we've had patrols at my own son's high school because of fear, because of parents either being taken into custody or fears that they will be, and fears that students will be taken into custody. So, when that becomes real and tangible to people, they tend to take action or look for ways to take action.
So, as a way to move to talk about government policy, we have a few questions. But remind us that if you look at unions, we talked about the services, but public sector unions have become and probably will become ever more important.
I think they're a majority in the U.S. now.
And as we already seen what happened in Wisconsin. You have not mentioned anything about surveillance by government agencies of the workers.
Right.
Would you care to tell us what's happening there, both from a point of view of surveillance and how the unions that there are already organized deal with that?
I would love to. I don't think I can actually speak with any expertise because the research for the book focused entirely on the private sector. There are different rules to some extent in the public sector, I will say. The rules for search are different in the public sector because of the constitutional overlay. To the extent workers in the public sector are unionized also, and they're more often unionized, they have some rights to sort of block certain forms of surveillance. But it's fluid. I mean, I certainly hear a lot about new surveillance technology being used with regard to teachers, for example. Education technology being used to monitor exactly what they're doing, to monitor how quickly they're teaching lessons or grading and whatnot. There's also the interesting story of, police body cameras in the United States, right? This is a form of public sector workers' surveillance. I just had a colleague who studies this give an interesting faculty talk on it. It is extremely helpful in one respect in trying to prove cases of unlawful use of force. On the other hand, it has made the job of attorneys who are representing people suing the police department or defendants in criminal cases, it's made their job a lot harder. Because if there are 5 police officers at an interaction, you have to analyze the body camera from all 5 police officers in order to have the record, which means you just, that's going to take you, that's another day's work, and somebody has to do it. So it's
AI, see?
Yeah,
you just
exactly.
need more
Right, I know.
surveillance and more
Right.
machine learning,
Right.
and everything will
Right.
be solved.
Exactly. So anyway, it's it's complex. I don't feel like I can speak on it, with as much expertise or authority. Yeah.
So let me push you a little bit
Yeah,
on that,
sure.
and then we'll move
Yeah.
on. Because you mentioned body cameras. One of the things that I found extremely interesting is that the same Uber drivers or Lyft drivers that are being surveilled as if there's no tomorrow are the same people that will put cameras inside their cars and
Yep.
outside their cars to have evidence that they are working properly
Yeah.
and there are no complaints against them.
That, and also if a passenger assaults them, that will be on camera.
Yeah.
Or if something, another driver runs into them, that will be on camera. Yeah.
Or if they hit a cyclist in Toronto, it will be on camera. But what is interesting is that those same people who, as you said, have been surveilled to death
Yeah.
and their knowledge, they actually opt to have even more surveillance.
Well, it's a different type of surveillance, though, right? It's a surveillance, surveillance they're using for their own purposes. The data from if I put a dashboard camera in my car, I don't have one, but if I put a dashboard camera in my car, I decide what happens with the images that are gathered for the most part, right? It's not that those are being transmitted to a company potentially thousands of miles away that then uses them to surveil, manage, discipline me in new ways. And I think that's very important, right? It's a very, very important distinction. Privacy is not necessarily about hiding things. It's about the uses that can be made of different types of information. My colleague Julie Cohen makes this as a definitional point. When we talk about privacy law, what are we talking about? We're not talking about secrecy. We're talking about allocating rights and information about other people. And, the privacy considerations when one puts a camera in their own house are just very different from those of being sort of monitored by a different camera.
I will just notice, you don't have to answer that, but I'll just notice that you talk privacy, but really you're talking about property rights and who has control over the users, both
They're intertwined, yeah.
So I'm not quite so sure that we should talk, especially in the current administration that you have south of a border, about privacy, or actually say the truth, that this is all rules about who is allowed to gather information,
That's right.
who is allowed to use information, and how.
That is completely correct.
And
yes.
privacy make it.
Yeah.
No.
Once again, well, actually, so to just put another plug, I
Yeah.
can't imagine Julie's watching, but if she is. So Julie makes a version of this point in her book, actually, that one of the ways that privacy law, what we call privacy law, operates today is it ends up allocating rights in data that then become propertized. I think that's her term, propertized. They're not, and she has a wonderful analysis I can't replicate about exactly how property law intersects there, but she makes a very similar point.
Yeah, so now there's a set of questions we sort of try to push back. And if you might remember, we're both old enough to remember the old taxis. The service was awful. And if you were an African American in New York, good luck getting in a taxi. So yes, they took away all the knowledge, but they actually, even Starbucks, significantly improved the service. And the fact that they use this and surveillance to discipline or punish also makes sure that the quality of the service is very high compared to the past. A question is, here, do you actually say that there is a balance that we have between quality and improvement and productivity in service and surveillance?
Yeah.
Or can we have both?
I do think we can have both. So I think this is a tension. I talk about this in if anyone's interested, a short essay called The Social Cost of Uber that was 2016, roughly, came out around then. One of the things, this may not sound responsive, but I think it is. One of the things that Uber does, that it did, is it consolidated the taxi industry. So rather than having, in a city, 1,000 or 10,000 individual proprietors, none of whom are subject to, all of whom are subject in theory to direct regulation, but are not subject to oversight by a company. You have a single company that is overseeing the work of tens of thousands of individual drivers. That makes that company amenable to regulation, at least operationally, in a way that was always very difficult with taxis. The data that is gathered can be used to improve services. It can be used to ensure non-discrimination. It can be used to ensure passenger safety. It can be used to ensure just access to a car when you need one, which, many cities were notorious for this, including Washington, D.C. It was just impossible to get a car to come to you. in many parts of the city. And you know,
Toronto at around 8 a.m. even 5 or 6 years ago.
Oh,
Good luck.
okay, great.
Yeah.
Note that for my trip to the airport tomorrow. So, you know, Uber was a phenomenal success in that respect. A point of pushback I would have is like, I don't know that they actually have stopped discriminating on the basis of race. Certainly, there have been quite a few lawsuits filed against them saying they tend not to send cabs into black neighborhoods in DC, not to send cars into black neighborhoods, that the pay in those neighborhoods tends to be lower than the pay in other neighborhoods. That drivers, you know, discriminate on the basis of race and canceling particular rides. And, you know, I have not kept up, I think a lot of, I have not kept up with the litigation. I do know the litigation is there, and just what I've seen from the company in the past, I am not especially confident. So another way of putting the point is that we could have the surveillance and the high quality, but we would need a regulatory structure that actually takes those goals more seriously.
Excellent, because we just moved to the next
Great.
question that I have here, which basically, to be slightly more rougher than and more vicious than the person who wrote this. When you basically talked about these rights and giving laborers a voice and all that wonderful thing. Why not government going much more strongly in and regulating surveillance, not just saying giving voice to the workers? Yes, we should vote whether we have surveillance. No,
Yeah.
but there are actual government regulation that
Yeah.
says here are the limits, here is how it works.
Yeah. I mean, this is part of, you know, abolition versus bargaining. I think there's some technologies whose use should simply be abolished. Employers should not be allowed to monitor where their workers are when they're off the job. They should not be able to monitor them in washrooms. They should not be able to use emotion recognizing technology or make a decision based on it, right?
But
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
can keep on, but there is a question. But it was the next, and that
Okay.
was if you can elaborate about why and also what do you think of the effect of that.
Of
But
emotion. Okay,
yeah, but
yeah.
keep on
Sure.
saying what government should not do.
Sure.
But
Yeah.
just because you mentioned it.
So yes, abolish certain uses and bargain over others. The idea of bargaining is, you know, if you think of these as two you know, sides of a scissors or two sides of a coin or whatever, abolish the worst uses of technology that don't seem to have many social goods attached to them. Bargain over the ones where it's very difficult, and this is probably most of them, it's very difficult to determine in advance if they're going to be used for productivity enhancement or power exertion, or what the balance of those uses is going to be. By the way, I have to say again, the productivity versus power framing, I think, came from Yochai Benkler as well. We were sort of exchanging drafts, and we might have sort of happened on it similarly, but anyway, I think I got it from him. So, you know, okay, you see this all the time in German codetermination. It's a highly imperfect system, but it is a system that's there. We are going to implement this new set of machines. Okay, workers, let's talk about how to implement them. And the workers will often be able to spot problems with the machines, help see what the workflow is going to look like in a way that's very hard for managers and especially top managers to spot. And you know, the idea is by granting consultation and in some cases bargaining rights, you give workers the ability to use social power to block the adoption of the worst technologies. And they will tend to favor technologies that actually improve productivity. You hear this from warehouse workers right now. Like, bring the robots, bring on the robots. Like, I don't want to keep doing this job where I'm going to lose the use of my arms if I do it another 10 years, right? Bring in the robot to do this, reassign me to something else in the, I always say factory, but in the warehouse that is more sustainable. So that's the theory there. It's that we have to play that out in practice, and there's a real role for allowing, you know, iterative technological change within workplaces that tends to enhance productivity.
So before emotion recognition,
Yeah.
just assuming everybody here know what is called determination.
Yes.
Let's elaborate on that.
So the German industrial relations system involves bargaining within industry anyway, bargaining mostly at the national level between firms and unions. So, the classic example I think is IG Metall, or IG Metall, the metal workers union. You set terms and conditions for all the auto workers, all the other jobs where people are bending steel or bending metal in factories. Okay. That's setting wages. Benefits are a slightly different calculation, hours of work, things of this nature. Then you have a system, but that bargaining happens, at a national level. Then you have a system of works councils at the local level within the actual plant, sometimes to the company level to some extent, where workers and management work out disputes and sort of concerns on a day-by-day basis. Works councils don't have the right to strike. They sometimes get around that, as I understand, because they have the right to refuse to perform overtime. So they may say, we really need progress on this question of how you're fixing this production holdup, or you might not get overtime next week. But it leads to day-by-day kind of collaboration a lot of the time between labor and management over solving particular problems.
And also by law.
Yes.
Above a certain
Correct.
company size,
Right.
workers have seats on the boards.
Seats on the board. Sorry, I thought you were going to say the Works Council, which
Yeah.
they're often not established, even if they're required by law. But workers, companies over a certain size, workers have seats on the board.
And just for those of you who don't know, the people who made the Germans do that are called the Americans after World War II.
Yes.
So it's not this is an un-American thinking. This is actually an American thinking trying to make sure that democracy happen in what they viewed as an undemocratic society.
That's right. Sort of weave social power into the economy.
Yeah, we just didn't do it in the US. Emotions recognition.
Yeah.
Somehow we never talk about it, so now I'll force you to talk about it. Why is it so bad?
It's pseudoscience. It doesn't work. So the idea is the following. If you are sitting at if you're on camera, the theory is that algorithmic processing of, particular patterns of expressions on your face can tell a computer or someone behind it what emotions you are feeling. There's a couple problems with this. One is that it's just never been validated. I mean, so psychologists have studied it. Every time they study it, they say the expressions that people make do not necessarily match the emotions that another person would feel while making that expression. Right? I might smile when I'm angry. It's an extreme example, right? But people do this all the time. But another is that the machines are just not really good. This will change, right? But it's just not very good at recognizing what emotions people have on their face. And this can be discriminatory because they tend to be trained on white individuals, and it's much, much harder for them as a result to recognize emotions on non-white individuals.
That's lovely, but still, let's assume it all fixed.
Let's
Is
assume
that the
what?
problem? It's fixed. Together with Elon Musk, who of course is a great genius, solved it. My machine know exactly what
I
emotion.
see.
Is that still a problem?
I think so.
Why?
I have a deep moral objection to it. I do want to just hold out that, I think it's not a fixable problem insofar as people's expressions, don't follow a schema that we want them to follow. They just don't match emotions. I think there are certain parts of human personality and human life that should be carved out from commodification, and this is one of them.
Okay.
That's my baseline. I mean, we could go on
No,
from there.
that's
Yeah,
fine. I
yeah.
just wanted to make sure because it was a question. And whether this is bad or not bad. Because I can go down and tell you it's not just the facial expression. I have a Fitbit and over rest. I can do heart
Yeah.
rate and over rest and really surveil you and know whether you're tensed or not.
Let me say
Yeah.
very quickly on the heart rate monitors and such. You see fewer of them than you might expect in the U.S. I was talking with someone about this earlier today. I don't have a fully worked out theory for why that is, but I have pieces of a theory. It's based on talking to unions. That employers don't necessarily want to have biometric data on employees, even when they're legally permitted to have it, because of facially permitted to have it, or prima facie permitted, because it can trigger duties under health privacy laws and under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So only a couple states regulate biometric data capture directly, but those other legal regimes seem to actually come in and create real deterrence to its gathering.
So I can tell you from my own research, which actually this is exactly why minors, those that still actually do go deep into the mines, actually love surveillance because it saves life.
Of this, yes, I was talking with Mark about this earlier today.
Yeah.
Right.
Now, I want to leave a little bit of unstructured time for the people that actually came here physically.
Sure.
And I will leave and you can talk with them. But we have one last somewhat dark question.
Okay.
Because we've been going to emotion over rest. And that is if you, or I should say a set of questions, if you go down to what you call algorithm discipline, as AI is becoming better and better and better, let's call it AI monitoring. What should be the principle under which we should think about whether it's even okay to develop it? And second, how can you envision a law or a set of regulation, which is more or less the same, to allow this to evolve in a way that are more positive and negative? Because if we don't do anything, it's already happening.
Yes.
So those two, how do you see this fight or development goes and how that impacts labor and humans? And B, what can be done?
Ezra Klein had on his podcast Cory Doctorow and someone else whose name I'm forgetting just earlier this week or last week. And they were telling stories about algorithmic discipline and workplace surveillance that and describing it in terms that make my book look like a celebration. That every bit of what makes human and social life possibly enjoyable and worth living is squeezed out through the relentless drive to monitor, quantify, keep people on task, and increase profits as a result, by doing so. Worth listening to. I mean, Dr. Rowe is a very, very interesting person on this. Okay, what principle? I mean, I don't know what to do other than, abolish and bargain. I don't know how to get there. That's the problem, right? We will have to have. There's always a dialectic between law and worker organizing, where workers sort of build on the law in their organizing, and the laws change over time to facilitate further organizing, or it goes in the other direction. This will not stop, I don't think, without a major social revolt against it. I think you see parts of this with AI, right? People are just disgusted with the implementation of LLMs into places where they're not needed. Like, I really do not need a large language model in my word processor, telling me what the next word should be. Like, maybe that's helpful every once in a while, but I really don't want it there. You might eventually have a broad social revolt against this, but it's hard to envision, in part because the harms are diffuse, right? We have an uprising in Minneapolis because the harms were not diffuse. The harms were actually very clear. They were very directly targeted at people who were protesting. So, I'm
Okay, so let me,
on days I'm optimistic, and on days we can go toe to toe on pessimism if you want. Yeah.
So let me bring some Canadian pride here. Since I wouldn't even ask you what you would recommend President Trump to do, because it will be a joke, but we have a different government here. If you've been called to Ottawa
Yeah.
and said, okay, this is a problem, how should we even think about it?
Sure.
And we have a power and we have a will.
Sure.
What are the principles?
Yeah. So, well, one is allow monitoring for production purposes and do so only upon consultation or bargaining with workers. That'd be the starting point. So if you want to have cameras trained at your employees, you can, and this is, established in the GDPR to some extent, you can gather that data to ensure things that are traditional managerial prerogatives, sound production, to prevent rule breaking, like don't steal from the company, to ensure workplace safety, to ensure anti-discrimination. But the data can't be sold, it can't be used for any other purpose, and the uses, insofar as they are dealing with questions of employee pay, hours, and discipline, have to be bargained. That would be my starting point.
Okay. Well, thank you. I will, it's great pleasure having
Thank
you
you.
here. I also want to thank all the IT team for their help and monitoring the online. Thanks to the online digital presence.
Exactly.
And I will let you stay here for about 10 or 15
Sure,
minutes if
yeah.
people just want to have chat before I'll force you to eat something.
Okay, sounds fantastic. Thank you so much, everyone. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Dan.